Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to January's webinar, Drupal for Gov webinar on content management from docs to components. And our speakers today are Yanko Ivanov and Madison Taylor. So before we begin, I always want to give thanks to our sponsors. A special thanks goes out to our January webinar sponsor, Mobomo. They leverage human-centered web design and advanced DevSecOps technologies to work with clients and deliver elegant solutions. So if you're interested, please check out their website. And most of you all probably know about Drupal for Gov, but for those who don't, we are a community we are interested in all things that are open source. So in addition to this monthly webinar that happens every third Thursday most months, we also have our yearly conference, Drupal GovCon, and we're still in the planning phases of that for 2022. So listen out for more information. We also do global training days and half days. We haven't done it as much due to COVID, but hopefully we can get back to doing those. And the Gov Summit at DrupalCon, North America. If you're interested in getting in touch or you have any questions or concerns and you're interested in actually presenting, you can find us on Slack as well as Twitter. Also, all of our webinars are recorded and you can find them on YouTube and also at our Drupal for Gov website. And now I'm gonna introduce Yanko Ivanov and Madison Taylor. So they both are from Enterprise Solutions. Yanko is an enterprise solutions architect with expertise in strategy, design, and implementation of content management systems, metadata, and knowledge graph solutions. And Madison Taylor is a business analyst with expertise in semantic content analysis, content migration, and content marketing. So thank you, welcome, and I'm gonna stop sharing my screen.
Thank you.
Take over.
Thank you, Nanika. I appreciate the introduction. That actually saves us a little bit of time too. So thanks everybody for having us today. We'll dive in. I am going to share and we'll dive in. We have a little bit of discussion here to go through. And as far as questions, we're happy to address any questions. Please post them in chat, or if it's something burning, please chime in and we can address it as we go or toward the end.
Let me correct, I said Enterprise Solutions. I meant Enterprise Knowledge. You should have corrected me.
That's okay. That is okay. Thank you. Appreciate it. Yes, so like Nika said, we're both from Enterprise Knowledge, and today we're focusing on getting from traditional content, more around the longer pages, longer documents, to a little bit more of the componentized content. And apologize for a second here. I need to move my Zoom controls because they appear right on the presentation. All right. So we're getting into componentized contents. We'll take a look at what that is. What are we talking about? But before that, we'll do a quick intro, which we actually did. Evolution of content delivery to modern content management. A little bit on the technical side in terms of architecture. Why are we here? Where are we going with that? And then Madison will talk a little bit about the value of modern content management, what componentized content actually gives us, both from the technical as well as the business side of things. And then we're actually going to take a look at the process, the general high-level process of how do we get from one to the other, what are the key steps, and what to look after. And then toward the end, hoping we have enough time, we'll do a quick modeling exercise to take a look at like one big piece of text and how we can segregate it into separate components that could potentially be used in different locations. All right, so with that, let's dive right in. I think we covered that, so there's not much to talk about here. And then diving into modern content management. All right. So today, in today's day and age, we're seeing more and more the need of producing content that is live, living, that needs to be updated frequently, that is produced and delivered on multiple different channels or platforms, whether it's a mobile or a website or even print. We can see here on the right. It's this is where we're starting to hit the big challenges. Now, before we had the big challenge of, hey, we have a lot of content. How do we find it? How do we search for it? But at least it was like one big document, good and bad, right? Nowadays, we're trying to see what can we deliver in a mobile device versus a full web page. Is it the same content? Is it different versions? How do we manage that? How do we manage different versions of the same conceptual content so that we are keeping it in sync, right? It's important that what you're displaying on your website is sort of the same thing as the mobile device delivery. Like I was saying, back in the day, not too long ago, we had the content management systems that where it allows you to create your content, publish it on the same system as a web page, website, and you're good to go, more or less. So that in itself was great to a certain extent, but it wasn't very scalable, right? Especially when we start talking about multiple devices or multiple platforms we are delivering to. So this is where we introduced the slightly different architecture, where we're talking about decoupled delivery architecture. You may have heard this term, but conceptually what this is we have the content authoring UI. So the content management system is in the backend. You have the front end, which is also technically the same platform, but it does provide an API that allows you to hook into this and deliver this content into your additional platforms, additional channels, and so on. So it's still a relatively monolithic system, but it does provide this additional layer that we can actually connect to. Great, so now we can export content, we can show it in multiple places. We're still addressing the challenges of, well, if it's one big web page that we produced in the content management system, how is this going to look into different formats, different form factors, and so on. So this is where we start getting into a little bit more complicated architectures, where the front end of this monolithic system is not even there anymore. The system is primarily focused for content authoring. This is where the componentized content usually comes into play as well, because it is focused on API, right? So API first, if you will, where we need to be able to deliver the content into multiple different ways to multiple different consumers. And right there is the need of, well, if I'm delivering it to an Apple Watch or a website, I need different things. So can I just pick and choose what I need from that piece of content? So structured content, we're starting to talk about structured content as well as componentized content. We'll take a look at all three of these, traditional, structured, and componentized in a second. But this is generally the idea where this starts getting introduced. Taking it a step further, when we're talking about a full enterprise implementation, a marketing, a product website, this is where we need to start talking about Taxonomy Manager, integrating the content authoring solution with other systems from the enterprise, like the digital asset management system, the Taxonomy Manager. You may have a product system or anything else that we need to get content from and put it as part of the website or the delivery channels. So there's a little bit of integration on the back end, but ultimately everything is getting delivered through this API, the same API. So the focus here is we're enhancing the capabilities of the authors, for the authors, as well as the richness of the content that we're delivering on the front end. Then the next piece, which is really, in my mind, this is the ultimate in content management, componentized content management is where we start talking about a full-fledged graph-based content management system. I'm putting graph-based in quotes because it doesn't necessarily have to be graph database, but that in itself provides us with some benefits that we happy to talk about that in a different conversation. But in any case, the idea here is that a solution like this allows us to integrate content and data, structured data from multiple different sources in our organization, not only one and two sources like in the previous solution, but this is becoming a more of a centralized repository for finding the content and data that is necessary for our ultimate front-end experience. An example would be, like I mentioned a little bit earlier, a product website where we may be writing the marketing material in here. There may be a digital asset management system for the graphics, and that in itself has its power. So that's important to have that there. And then we have the actual structured data source, whether it's a SQL system, a PIM, is a product management system, or whatever that is, that allows us to integrate the content with the data and produce it as one experience. Again, an example, a commerce or a product website, you can have the product description, the product image coming from your content management system as well as the DAM, but the product pricing, where does that come from? Are you allowing your authors to set the price for that, or is that a completely separate department? And if it is a separate department, that's probably they have their own system where they set the pricing for each of these products. So can we connect those two? So the website basically consumes everything at once? Sure, that's really the goal here. And why it's important to be looking at a graph solution is because the graph really allows us to connect data from different sources without necessarily moving the data. But anyway, so that's at a high level. I'm kind of breezing through this a little bit because I really want to focus on the componentized piece. But I wanted to kind of set the stage of where we are in terms of architecture. Where does this sit in that aspect? And from here, we'll take a look at the value. Now, we talked about the technical pieces, the architecture pieces, but why do we really need to do this? What is important to talk about? Why is it important to talk about componentized content reuse, and so on? So I'll turn it over to Madison, and she'll walk us through that.
Thank you, Yanko. So yes, we are now going to get into the business value of componentized content. There are 4 key features of componentized content that make it an asset to supporting your organization or business's goals and needs. The first key feature is enabling content reuse. Content components can be attached to more than one page, allowing you to make changes in one place and have them update efficiently on all pages where that content is applied. Content reuse is also a business value in that it improves content consistency with the same version of the content appearing on multiple sites. Content consistency through reuse also reduces organizational risk since there is less chance to share old or outdated information. A second key feature is enabling multi-channel content delivery, where the same content is delivered to multiple channels. A business value of multi-channel delivery is improved response rates through flexible presentation of content to end users. The wide reach of multi-channel delivery is also a business asset. You can meet users where they are on the device and platform of their choice and provide them with the desired content at their time of need. And with a multi-channel delivery strategy, you can build rich, dynamic end user experiences with consistent messaging between multiple channels. Another key feature of componentized content is it enables users to find answers to their questions. This is a business value since componentized content improves the search experience and answers users' questions in the specific way they are searching. Users can get to the answer more quickly with search results that provide components with the answer rather than long documents. Componentized content is the foundation for chatbots and AI, and it improves your organization's credibility by gaining the end user's trust through providing them with relevant content in their search results. A fourth key feature is enabling personalized content. In this day and age, especially with the pandemic forcing a major shift to the digital space, personalized content is no longer a choice for businesses and organizations. It's an absolute must. Applying metadata at the granular level of content components enables information to be presented in a personalized context based on needs of an identified user persona or even an individual user. This granularity of personalization is a business value since it can improve conversion rates. For example, an end user is more likely to complete an action if the call to action button is personalized. Personalization also improves the overall user experience since users will feel seen as an individual human and not just a data point. This end user attitude is important for winning and keeping business. Improved user experience also in turn provides increased loyalty and engagement. So now that we've gone over these key features of componentized content business value, does this ring a bell for anyone with any of your current use cases? And if so, we would love to hear about this towards the end of our session. So I'm going to now turn this back to you, Yanko.
Thanks, Madison. So pausing here for a second, I'm taking a look at the time just to time it. We have time, we have plenty of time. Pausing it for a second, wanted to make sure we're tracking. Does any questions so far, both on the technical side as well as the value? Does this ring a bell, like Madison mentioned? And any questions do you have currently, or should we save it for the end? I'm looking at the chat. So far, it's relatively quiet. I am taking this as a sign of everybody understands what we're talking about here. So let's go. Okay. So now the main portion of this is talking about how do we get from the traditional content to structured. And when I say structured content here, it's really structured as well as componentized. But to get to componentized, we actually need to structure the content first. So that's why it's structured. Okay. So we've been talking about unstructured or traditional, structured and componentized content. So let's take a look at each of these and make sure we're all are on the same page about what we mean by these terms. Right. So what we're seeing here on the left is a representation of a, think of it as a document or a web page. And this is the authoring experience. Forget about the UX. We're not talking about the front end yet, with a small caveat. We'll get to that. So this should be familiar. Think of it, so the purple is the content item itself, or document or web page. And the gray area is your content editing field. So in this case, one content item is one content editing field where you have the footage text. You can start adding your title. Let's say this is the title of the document or a web page. A little description here, heading 1, heading 2s. It's really just a regular WYSIWYG that allows you to have pretty flexible user authoring experience. You can include images here, potentially. You can include tables and so on. So the full flexibility for the author is here, but everything is in one place. Well, except images. That's a whole different story, but everything is in one place, including how this content will be appearing on the front end of the website. So far, everybody's with me? So far, so good? All right, great. Now we're starting to talk about structured content, where we can start separating these things out in separate fields. We're still in the same content item, still in the same document or web page, but now we have several different fields. Now, many of the content management systems out there are really ready and provide this functionality already, where you can specify different fields for a content item or content type, where You have a text field, a simple plain text field for your title. Short summary, for example, could be another one. Then you have the body. And the body would be, again, WYSIWYG, a rich text editor that still allows you to do pretty much the same in terms of functionality, in terms of richness of what you enter here, in terms of bold, italics, and so on. But then you also have separated these things out. So we have highlights here as a single bulleted list. And in this example, we've separated them out as separate items, separate fields. This is, of course, example, and there's different ways of doing that. But the idea is that in your article, this type of article, you always have these fields. You have a body, you have highlights. You may have only one highlight or two or three, but it's available for you. So far, again, makes sense. Structuring content based on of something existing. We're actually going to go through the process of doing that, at least to some extent, but at least the concept should be familiar. And again, if there are any questions, please drop them in chat. Happy to discuss. All right, enter componentized content. This is where we start talking about multiple different components of the same one or more content items. So let's say, again, we have the title, which is a field. We have the short summary, which is, again, a field. We don't want to separate it as a component yet, but it is a field in that article that we're talking about. Remember, the purple area is still one article. However, this is where we start getting into the interesting stuff. The main content section, it's a section. It's composed of multiple components because we decided, hey, this content makes sense to break it up into different sections. Let's break it up because it's going to be reusable. It's going to be something that we can actually pull out and put in other content items. Later in the presentation, we actually have the example, and I'll show you exactly what that looks like, where the main content, one big blurb of text, can be broken up by paragraph or not. We'll see that as well, because we want to reuse some of this. Here's an example. The about section from this main content may be interesting to pull out as a separate component, meaning a separate content item in our system that is then related. So think of it as a parent-child relationship, right? So this big article is the parent, and then we can have the child relationship to different content items. So the about section is a content item in itself, and obviously can have multiple fields in it, but generally speaking, it's the text field that allows us to add the about text and the title, of course. But why we want to pull it out? Well, because like I mentioned earlier, we could be able to reuse it somewhere else. So if we're writing an article about, well, the example that we're going to be using later is about the SNAP program by the USDA. And that program, it has a website in itself. So if you're writing an article about it, well, why don't we use that about section in the article for something that is already on the website or is not yet? Like, should we have an about page? That's probably content that we can use in that page as well without having to copy paste it multiple times. It's just a content item that we can just connect to. The beauty of this is that once we're writing this content item here, and we know what kind of components we are looking for, we can easily find them in the content management system. Again, the system has to be able to support this functionality. As you can see, this is different functionality than just regular CMS. This is where we're talking about a componentized content management system. Getting to this, let's say I'm writing the content here, and then in the main content section, I want to add an about section. Sure, let me go and search if there are about sections for this specific topic. Notice that I'm saying for the specific topic. This is important because if the system is not allowing us to tag each of these content items with specific taxonomy, specific metadata, we're never going to be able to find them and reuse them again. So this is a critical piece, and we'll take a look at that as well in a second. Then again, next section would be, let's say I want to say administration. Let me look for in the system. I go do a quick search in the system, and I'm finding that, yeah, hey, we have a section on administration about this Snap program. Sure, let me take a look. It looks good. I'll add it in. Done. I don't have to write it again. I don't have to replicate the text. It's there. But what if I wanted to add something that isn't in the system, or I'm not finding the component that is not there? Well, that's fine. We can still continue writing here. And again, this depends on the UI of the authoring experience. But technically, I could be writing within this document. At the same time, this is an actual component that lives as a separate component in itself. Similarly here, the highlights, they were already structured. So why don't we just take them out as separate components? Again, one of the main reasons is they could be reused in multiple different places. Another reason, like Madison mentioned earlier, is customization. We'll take a look in the example later, but if in this program, the Snap program is supplying is helping families with food, basically. And let's say I'm coming into the system, I've created my account, and if I have set my preferences that, hey, I'm interested in nutrition, well, okay, great. Because the system knows that your interest is in nutrition, I can potentially show you the highlights that are for nutrition rather than something else that is not relevant to you. So this is how we can use some of these components to customize the experience, the end user experience, to them. So it makes it much more relevant, like basically what Madison was saying. We're personalizing the experience to them. All right, pause it here for a second. Questions? Does this make sense? Everybody's awfully quiet. Right, it does. Okay, good. Great. Okay, so high level benefits or pros and cons for each of these. In the unstructured content, where we have one big monolithic piece of content for the web page, I mentioned it earlier. The author has the full control of how this thing is going to look and feel. And it can be delivered in multiple channels, yes, but it's going to be this one big article. So you're leaving the delivery platform pretty much stuck with what you've already put in that article. So they can't do much with that. Whereas with structured content, yep, the delivery channel can pick and choose the pieces of that content that they care about. Let's say it's for a mobile device, we may not need the short description of the article. So, okay, I don't want it, so I'm not going to get it from the system, and so on. Componentized content, the pros, you publish the content once and it's available everywhere. There's the technicalities, of course, and the architecture of the system, but from an authoring perspective, hey, I've published the content. How you use it, that is totally up to you. How you present it, that is totally up to the UX team. And that is important because me as an author, I'm not a UX person. Yeah, sure, I can make things look relatively pretty, but so-so. Whereas a UX person knows exactly what they're doing, how a user is using our website, what they're looking for, where they're looking it for on the website. So breaking the content up allows the UX person to say, the title goes here, the short description goes right underneath, the pricing of the product will go on the right side, and so on and so on, right? So we are providing the content, how it's displayed is not a problem anymore from an authoring perspective. It is the UX design team that will tell us where things go and which things actually are displayed where. A quick note on the componentized content. Yep, the downside is that it does take a little bit to get going. There is a little bit of a higher learning curve for the authors. because coming from the aspect of, hey, let me write everything I know about this, to let me think about how to break this thing up versus this goes here versus this goes there from a content perspective, it does require a little bit of a mental shift. So that's something that you need to be prepared for. It has to be on your roadmap to train your author and help them through that transition. It's not something to ignore. We mentioned higher initial setup period and requires a robust taxonomy for sure in a componentized content management. If you don't have a taxonomy to manage, tag, and maintain each of your components, you're not going to be able to find them. You're not going to leverage them for use. And soon you will have a big mess on your hands. So far, so good again? Yep, all right. Okay. Let's take a look at the process. Now, this is the high-level steps. Each of these steps are, I mean, this can be a webinar in itself. So let's take a look at a high level, and then the next couple of slides, or the next, well, until the end, we'll take a look at this part, the modeling of the structured content, which is pretty interesting. And this is the challenging, well, one of the challenging parts, but how do we get from one big article to breaking it up? All right, so before we get there, we need to know what we're doing. So step number one is, what is this site or whatever delivery channel that you're putting out? What is this for? What is the scope of the content that you want to include in that? Let's start with one delivery channel. Then ultimately, when we're designing the structured content, we shouldn't really care about how many delivery channels and what delivery channels are there, as long as the content is well structured. In reality, yeah, you still take a look at how the content is going to be used, because this gives you an idea how to break it up. We'll be talking a little bit about that in a second. So yes, defining the scope and what are we trying to achieve? Is it a site that is highly personalizable or personalized for different audiences or down to each user? Or is it something that is more, we're talking about content reuse, multiple places where the same content appears multiple times? Or are we trying to design something that is more around search answering, bite-sized search answering, where you're probably familiar with Google. You go and type a question, and Google understands the question and gives you the actual answer. It doesn't give you the full 500-page document. It is just 2-sentence answer. Well, yes, Google, that's their business, right? We don't want to spend millions and billions on that project. So, but there is a way of doing that with componentized content. So if we have the component and we know that answers the question, we can present that little component, a little piece of text or content as the answer. All right, so back to the scope. What are we trying to achieve with that site will guide us into how to break up the content and what kind of content we'll need. So the next piece is, well, great, now we know what we want to do. What content do we have? Let's take a look at what we have, what state it is in. Do we have a lot of duplicated content? Do we have a bunch of different old versions that shouldn't be displayed on the front end? And so on, as well as similar content that is giving us different information, so conflicting information. That's one of the challenges that Madison addressed a little bit earlier. As well as, I mean, okay, we've looked at the content, we've identified old versions, outdated items. Now we need to identify what actually is going to be going into the new system. So that's part of the content analysis piece. Then we get into the modeling of the structured content. We look at each of these items. And my recommendation is to start small, at least start with several items rather than boiling the ocean from the start. We want to look at 2, 3, 4 types of content to figure out what are the common pieces, are there common pieces, and start identifying the different component types for that content and so on. I just came up with a term here, the units of meaning in terms of breaking up the content. So think of it this way. If we're looking at a big article or a big document, I'll throw another example here, product documentation. In my mind, a unit of meaning is a feature. And what I mean by this is we have a description of the product, we have all the features of that product in the user guide, as well as a bunch of other information like legalese and troubleshooting tips and so on. But each of these features is a unit of meaning because it means something. It's a self-sustaining, more or less, piece of content that can be associated to that product. I'm just looking at the content. Units of meaning is a helpful way to better convey this concept to people who don't live and bring a content management strategy. Absolutely, yeah. So that's the goal here: identifying the pieces that can be broken out for the purposes of reuse, for the purposes of customization, for the purposes of access control. You may not allow everybody to control each of these pieces. For example, the legalese in your product manual shouldn't be managed, authored, or edited by authors, for example. It could be your legal department saying, yeah, really the terms and conditions. And one last piece here is the taxonomy. It's very important. Like I mentioned earlier, for each of these items, we need to identify what kind of metadata do we need so that we can easily find it, as well as allow the channels, the delivery channels, whether it's a website, another consuming service, and so on, to find the content that they need. So in the product manual example, will be both administrative taxonomy, like, yes, this is this type of content type, this is a feature content type, as well as what this content is about. This content is about this product, it's about this product model, it's about this product year, things like that. So that you can easily search, filter, and find the content that you care about or the features that you care about, and technically can assemble that toward the end, the delivery channel itself. All right, so we'll spend a little more time on the modeling part in a second, but just to wrap this part, the kind of the high level process, I mentioned preparing your authors for this, and this is where I'm talking about the change management. We need to make sure that they understand what we're doing, why we're doing it, and are on board, of course, and have an input into the modeling, into the content modeling for sure, because the content engineer, the content modeler, or architect may not be the subject matter expert on the content itself. I can start looking at the article and kind of figure out the different pieces, but an author will be able to give me a much deeper view of what's going on there. So the communication as well as training. We need to be able to train both the authors as well as the technical and administrative teams that will be maintaining the system and administering the system as well. Question. Do you find the UX people need inputs into the content modeling as well? Yeah, that's actually a good point. Yes, I believe so. In an ideal world, the UX team will be will have part of that modeling, because they'll be able to tell you, hey, I need this little component to be segregated or separated out so I can actually use it as a separate thing and put it on this side of this part of the screen versus having it as bundled up as a whole thing. Or I want to be able to personalize it. And again, this is the component that I care about to show to some people, but not to others. So that tells you that right away, that needs to be a separate component. All right, and then the last step here is obviously the migration of the process of the content. That could and usually is a multi-step process. You like I was saying earlier, you're not going to do the boil the ocean from the start. There are different approaches in taking it. Either move the whole content as it is to the new componentized system and then start breaking it up slowly, or move, as you're moving it, you're breaking it up and you're putting it into the components, but you're moving it a chunk at a time. Like here, let's say we're talking about this page on the site. Let's move that, the content that goes on that page, and break it up and put it in the new system. And this really depends on multiple different factors, timelines, scope of the content, segregation. Like, are we talking about completely separate business units? Then yeah, it's probably easier to make it chunk by chunk and so on. Any questions on that? Does this generally make sense? Thoughts? Right, the migrate content part seems to be all manual and time consuming. That sure it is. It is not an easy part. It's not the most exciting part as well, and that's why I mentioned that it is going to be a piecemeal activity, because you can expect everything to stop and wait for you for 2 months, 3 months to go and start migrating content. Nobody's going to give you that. The way it's generally done is you prepare the infrastructure for the new site, and that's what I was saying. You can start migrating it slowly in terms of step by step, as long as the infrastructure of the new site is there. And the time-consuming part, sure, it is, if you look at it as one big step that you have to take. But if you break it up into smaller sections, smaller steps, that actually blends into your more or less day-to-day activities. For example, if I have longer lead into before go live kind of thing, the authors can start putting their content into the CCMS, the componentized sections, before you're even live. And as long as you have the backward compatibility, so there's a technical component there. As long as you can provide that, that doesn't change, or it doesn't add much more time to your authors for migrating the actual content, but it's more focusing on the new content. And then it's a question of what do you want to do with all the content? Do you want to all migrate it all? Or do you want to keep it as it is and deal with it that way? It really depends on the use case. We've seen it either way. And there, like I said, there are different factors to consider that. But yes, it's not an easy task, and there are a few moving pieces there. Totally doable though.
You also have another question. Do you find the UX people need input into the content modeling as well?
Yeah, I think I addressed it, but if we missed it, yes, UX team usually should, in an ideal world, should have an input to the content modeling, because they can tell you what components, what pieces of the content they need in different places of the site. So that tells you exactly what needs to be broken out for sure. Yes, it is. Okay. All right, so taking a quick look at considerations and tips and examples for structured content. So this is focusing on the modeling part. We're looking at content and trying to figure out what should we break up? What should we break into separate components? So the first thing to think about is this thing, should it be customizable? Is that something that some people or one audience sees versus others don't? Then that's a good candidate for it to be broken out into a separate component, because that way it's easily customizable. You can easily either show it or not. The next one is a component required in every delivery channel or only some? Similar to the above, if there's a difference on how you display this, whether you display it or not, that's also a very strong hint that this should be broken out. Trying to come up with an example on the fly on this one. We'll probably come up with that in a second. Right. So is this something that you want your users to be able to filter on? Products and product models. Like I was saying earlier, in your technical documentation, if you have product or service that you want to not only search for but also filter for, then this should be probably in your taxonomy rather than as part of your document. And yes, you can include the taxonomy term in the document for sure, but it has to be separated in a way that the search engine can pick it up as a filter. So while it's not necessarily a content component, it is a taxonomy item that needs to be separate. Is this something I want users to be able to filter on? I just looked at that. Can I use the component in other publications? Again, a good example about this is an author of an article. I mean, we're all familiar with that. An author should be able to, the name should be able to be reused in every article that author is actually the author of. So instead of putting it multiple places manually, just put the author in a component, a content item, and then link to it for each article. So this is a very simple example, but that's the idea there of content reuse. Will this component need to change across article and publications? Well, yeah, if it is changing across article and publications, then maybe not necessarily the best idea for segregating it as a separate component. Again, depends on the use case, but if you're going to be modifying it anyway for every time you're publishing it, then you're creating a new version anyway. So there's no need to put it out as a separate component. Any thoughts on this? Kind of makes sense. All right, we'll put this in action in 1 second. All right, looking at time, we're getting there. All right, so modeling example. I mentioned the SNAP program by the USDA. It's so imagine, put your designer hat on, content designer hat on, and here's the situation. We are a federal agency. We have the content for it. We want to put together a website for that, as well as a mobile app to put out the agency content. We will be using user experience designers to define how this website looks, what components are there, and so on. So the agency needs your help to break up the content to make it structured. All right, so because we are running kind of close on time, I'm not going to ask you all to read this, although this would be fun. We'll go through this exercise and I'll show you what my process is anyway. So we have one big piece of content, whether it's a PDF, a document, a web page, whatever that is, it's a piece of content. So let's scan what this is about and see what are the semantic units of meaning that we can potentially take out that could potentially be reusable. So the first, the supplementary provides nutrition assistance to eligible low-income individuals and households via monthly benefit, blah, blah, blah. Okay. That sounds to me like an about section or a description of what this thing is. Yeah. Yes, I know what this is, but that's the process, right? So we start identifying this and say, okay, well, this is an about section. Can we use this in somewhere else rather than just this one article? Probably. Why not as the about us section of the site? Next is, let's take a look at this. Food and Nutritional administers SNAP at a federal level. USDA also authorizes the monitors. Right, so this is more on the administrative side of things. Who administers this program? How do they do it? So it sounds like this could be an administration type of section. Now, I'm not saying that this is going to definitely be a separate section on the website, but it can be, or it can be part of an administration page, right? So it's semantically meaningful to be potentially standalone piece of text. So far we've looked at, yeah, these paragraphs are generally easy to break up because we're breaking it up on a paragraph. But what about this next one? This one, I'll spare you me mumbling around it, but this one actually separates into two separate pieces. This section over here describes how the program works. What are the different steps that participating households must do? And one thing that I noticed when I was going through this, and I noticed that it was not here, was who is eligible. So eligibility requirements were not part of this content, but are probably semantically meaningful piece of content that we can use in multiple different places, whether it's on the website, on a document, and so on. So we can create a separate content item for eligibility requirements. So this one was how it works. Again, you can easily put this either on the full page or on the FAQ section of the site. Notice how it's the same content in two different places. And then this one is for retailer requirements. These are the actual retailers that are participants in the program. We can have that. And then the last two, again, notice how this one paragraph actually broke up into two separate pieces. Same with this one. In this case, this is actually just a sentence, but it's two semantically different things. Now, if you wanted to, yes, you can put it in one, just put contacts, great. But what if you wanted to separate it state versus federal? If you separate it state versus federal, you can customize your website to display the requirements or the state contact for your own state. So let's say I'm a participant in the program and I go to the state and say, how do I contact you? Show me only the ones that I care about in my state, not everything. Right, so that was a very quick example, but literally just going through the content, and yes, it's a manual step. There is no automated way of figuring out what's what, at least not yet that I know of. But the idea is to figure out what can be reused, what can be used as a single meaningful component that can be used in multiple places. And then when you identify each of these pieces, we need to figure out what is the metadata for that, right? So if I'm talking about how it works, what is the metadata? How what works? How does it work today? Did it work differently in the previous time? So there is a different metadata that needs to be considered and applied to each of these pieces. Okay, we're right just about time. Leaving a few minutes for Q&A, but hopefully this was helpful. Was it? Was it helpful? Let me know. Any questions? AI, yes. We'll definitely need some amazing AI. We're not quite there yet. There is progress, but not quite there yet.
I think it would be helpful to see at some point like how this is built, like within Drupal, like some examples. But otherwise, it is a great start to like understand the concept of like the reasons behind it and how you go about starting the process.
Yeah, this is actually great. Putting it behind on Drupal, this was definitely something we covered in the conference. We did a 4-hour training. So some of these slides may look familiar if you were in that training. I'm not going to claim yes or no, but we also had an example of how this was done in Drupal with that snap example as well, how you can separate it out into different content items. This is where the content engineering comes in place, and you need to know your system better, but absolutely, we can do a follow-up. All right, so while the examples would be fantastic, we're into issues of display flexibility and good finding solutions. Yeah, great. This is actually interesting. I'm excited to hear this because we can put something for next time or the next webinar where we can dive into more on the technical side of doing all this stuff that I just talked about, both Madison and I. In the meantime, all right, so this is our contact information, and I think this is recorded as well, but Nika is please reach out with any questions to me, Madison. We're happy to discuss this offline with any more detail. Question. Do you have advice for ensuring content authors write each part of the content in a way that when I put together, the page reads in a natural way as opposed to some? Yes. Yep. The big piece is the content author training here. And then the second piece would be the authoring experience. So while you're trying to make them think in a separate components kind of way, the authoring experience should let them put together one unified document, page, whatever that content type is, so that they see the context of what they're writing about. There are trickiness. There are absolutely. It's not something that you just tomorrow you start writing and you're all good. And there are some famous examples of how not to do things out there, and I should probably come up with those. I've seen some that are like, what? But that's a tricky one where a little training, a little bit of experience come in play as well. I'll try to think of specific examples for potentially next time. That was a good question. And yes, that's a good question. And we have, I think we were going to post this on chat, but in any case, there are some additional pieces of content to talk about this topic, and we're happy to chat more about that. So with that, we have 3 minutes. I'm still here for any questions or anything of that sort. But yeah.
Yeah. We'll provide links to the content, and also we'll have the videos in YouTube.
Yes, and Nico, I'll share with you the slides that we just went through. So if anybody's interested, we're happy to share that as well.
Awesome. Rebecca asked, I don't know if this is a question. That is a long-term coaching need, not a one-time training need. It's a big transition for content.
Yes. So Rebecca's comment here is actually right on point about what I was saying in terms of the authoring. I think we're addressing the question, Aubrey's question about the authoring, how to author so that it doesn't sound chunky. Yes, it's so you're probably seeing some of this. It's not just authoring and training, but also your model, your content model will actually change over time. You may need to add or break things up a little bit more, or put things back together if it doesn't make sense to keep them separate. It's a living experience. Ideally, it's not going to change very often, but sometimes you need to add a new field, a new version of the field, and that is to address some of these challenges. All right, so I think we're just at time. Thank you everybody for your time. Hopefully this was interesting and helpful. Like I said, we're happy to continue the discussion offline. Please reach out anytime. And,
thank you.
Happy to.
Everybody stay warm and see you next month.
Bye everybody.
Bye.
Bye.